All right, let's get into it. We're going to tackle the incredible journey of Middle English literature. And trust me, this is super important stuff if you've got any kind of advanced literary exam on the horizon.
So let's set the scene. Imagine this. It's 1066, and the English language is basically silenced overnight. We start with this massive crisis, the Norman Conquest, which just completely demotes English. For centuries, it becomes the language of the common folk, not the powerful.
So William the Conqueror rolls in, wins the battle, and suddenly Norman, French, and Latin are the languages of, well, everything that matters. The government, the courts, the church. The native English tongue, it gets pushed way, way to the margins.
And you have to understand, for almost 300 years, English was pretty much just a spoken language. For the uneducated masses, it completely lost its literary standard. And what happens when there's no official written standard? Well, it splinters. You get all these different regional dialects just kind of doing their own thing. But languages are tough. They're resilient. Now we're going to see how a series of, honestly, pretty chaotic historical events created the perfect storm for English to make this incredible comeback.
Okay, this timeline is where things get really interesting because it shows how a bunch of crises actually, weirdly, helped English. First up, 1204, the English nobility loses their land in Normandy. Boom! Their deep ties to France are basically severed. Then, fast forward a bit, and you get the Black Death, a horrifying plague, but it creates this massive labor shortage, which suddenly makes the English-speaking workforce way more powerful. But here's the one you absolutely need to circle for your exams: the 1362 Pleading in English Act. This law forced the courts to use English. I mean, what a huge official stamp of approval for the language. And finally, to top it all off, along comes Caxton's printing press, which is the real game changer for standardizing English for good.
So, all that splintering we talked about, it led to this amazing landscape of different Englishes, right? Each region had its own vibe, its own incredible literature. But what's so fascinating is how one of these dialects, the East Midland one, was just perfectly placed to become the new standard. Think about it. It's the language of London, of business, of Oxford and Cambridge. It was kind of like a compromise, sitting right there between the North and the South so more people could understand it. And the main reason, the number one reason for that dialect's takeover, can be boiled down to one single name: Geoffrey Chaucer. I mean, Chaucer was an absolute genius at mixing things up. He looked at what the sophisticated poets in France and Italy were doing, things like the 7-line rhyme royal stanza and this rhyming 10-syllable thing called the heroic couplet, and he basically said, hey, we can do that in English. He was building the poetic toolkit that guys like Shakespeare would be using centuries later. Incredible. And his masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales, it wasn't just some story. It was like a photograph of his entire society. By using this clever frame of a group of pilgrims on a journey, he gets to explore every single walk of life. You've got the noble knight, the super corrupt pardoner. He brilliantly captures the whole social fabric of his time. It's what scholars call a state satire, and it is just masterfully done. And here's a perfect example of his subtle, witty irony. This is a classic exam question, so listen up. The prioress, a nun, has this brooch that says, "Love conquers all." So the question is, what kind of love are we talking about here? Is it divine love for God? Or is it a hint at a more worldly, romantic kind of love? Chaucer just leaves it hanging there. He never tells you. And that's what makes it so brilliant.
But wait, Chaucer's sophisticated, courtly style wasn't the only thing going on. Not by a long shot. At the exact same time, in the north and the west of England, a totally different tradition, something more rugged, more ancient, was having a massive comeback.
Okay, so this is super important to get your head around. The rebirth of English literature was happening on two fronts at the same time. You had Chaucer in London with his polished, modern, rhyming poetry, but out in the provinces, you had these other poets who were reviving this powerful traditional verse that was all about alliteration and stress. It sounded way more like the old Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf. And these were not just some quaint little poems. No way. These were massive, profound explorations of what it means to be human. You have Piers Plowman, which is the sprawling, almost furious critique of all the corruption in society and the church. And then you have Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is basically a tense psychological thriller about what happens when a knight's perfect code clashes with his very human instincts. So, let's zoom in on one of the most famous symbols in all of English lit, the pentangle, from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Right, exam flash. This is a classic. The pentangle, this five-pointed star on Gawain's shield, is literally the symbol of his absolute, interconnected moral perfection. So, the entire poem becomes a test of that perfection, and spoiler alert, it's an ideal he tragically fails to live up to. It's this incredible reminder of the gap between the perfect chivalric ideal and, well, messy human reality.
So English is feeling pretty confident now in its poetry, right? It's time to branch out. The language starts to conquer whole new territories, moving from the page to the public stage, and even into these intensely private personal writings about faith.
Yeah, I mean, drama literally walked out of the church and onto the streets. It started as these simple little dialogues in Latin during the Easter service, but it evolved into these massive, citywide events called mystery cycles. The whole town would come out to watch the entire story of the Bible, from creation to doomsday, unfold on these cool mobile stages called pageant wagons. And this period also saw the rise of these powerful new voices in prose, especially from women. Take Julian of Norwich. She was an anchorite, meaning she lived in total isolation, and she wrote this incredibly profound and hopeful work of theology. Think about that for a second. This is a monumental achievement. It's the very first book we have in the English language that we know was written by a woman.
And then there's the one and only Marjorie Kemp. She is completely different. If Julian's voice came from a place of quiet contemplation, Marjorie's was out there in the world. She was a traveler, a mom, a businesswoman, and honestly a pretty controversial public figure. Her book is this raw, intense, and intimate look into her life, and it's considered the very first autobiography in English. So you put her and Julian together, and you can see the incredible new range that English prose was developing.
So, as we're wrapping up the Middle Ages here, two key figures really set the stage for the absolute explosion of literature that was about to happen in the Renaissance. First, you have Sir Thomas Malory. He takes all these sprawling, messy legends about King Arthur and compiles them into one great, coherent story. He's basically preserving this nostalgic ideal of knighthood. And then along comes William Caxton with his printing press. He prints Malory's book, and suddenly that story is available to so many more people. This was huge for standardizing the English language and making the whole Arthurian myth a cornerstone of English identity for centuries.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. You could say Chaucer, the great artist, proved that English could be beautiful and sophisticated. But it was Caxton, the innovator, whose printing press gave that language a standard form and a reach it never had before. So which was more important in forging the future of English, the pen or the press, the art or the technology? That's definitely something to think about for your essays. Thanks so much for joining me.